Greetings, my name is Uma Jules, and I'm going to read a story to you today. We're going to read a fairy tale written by Bo List. All right, it's a fairy tale written by a fairy for fairies and read by a fairy. Are we ready? Once upon a time, there was a king and a queen, and their son the prince. As the prince grew into adulthood, he didn't seem as interested in finding a princess and future queen like the princes of other kingdoms. This worried the king and queen, as they had badly wanted to make sure that when the prince became king, he would have heirs to pass the kingdom. And so a great ball was held, and princesses from across the land assembled to meet the prince, dance with him, and each hoped that she would be the one chosen. But while he was very polite and very interested in getting to know each of his potential wives, and was a very, very good dancer, he didn't find quite what he was looking for. He didn't know exactly what that was, but he knew that it was not to be found in any of the lovely women who attended the ball. And so another ball was held, because this was the great matchmaking tool of this particular kingdom, and of most kingdoms. But this second ball yielded no match, and so another was held, then another, and then another, to no avail. One day, the king was feeling old, and with that age came impatience. He summoned the prince to the throne room, and there he instructed that the prince would go on a great journey. If the right wife hadn't yet traveled to the kingdom to meet the prince must journey to find her. "Come back to me within 1 year," the king commanded, "and bring back a bride." And so the prince mounted his horse and set out past the reaches of his kingdom. Weeks went by, months came and went, and soon the year was almost up, and the king and queen eagerly awaited the prince's return. One day, a message made its way to the queen through one of her spies. Alarmed, she raced to the king to tell him what she had learned, and yet it was difficult to find the words. The king was sure to be very angry by the contents of this message, for nothing like it had ever happened in this kingdom or in any other kingdom they had known about. "Dear husband," the queen said, her voice a tremble, "the prince has been located." "Grand," bellowed the king. "But is he safe?" "Yes," replied the queen. "And has he found love on his journey?" the king asked. "Yes," replied the queen. "It would seem so." "Excellent," bellowed the king. "And what is this princess's name?" he asked. Stammered the queen. "Yes, yes," said the king. "Speak up." The prince's newfound love is named." "Yes, yes, speak up, woman." The queen gathered her wits. "The prince's newfound love is named Carl." "Carl?" the king asked. "Carl is a most unusual name for a princess." "Yes," replied the queen, "because Carl isn't a princess at all, rather a prince." The king heard this and didn't speak again for a few moments. This news was not news to him. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he always thought that this could be a possibility, that the prince wouldn't be like most of the other boys. There had been signs, clues, yet the king had many plans for the kingdom and the prince, and this development was not one of them. "I believe that our son may have found love somewhere besides the arms of a princess," the queen said to the king. The king rose from the throne and marched a hasty exit to the door of the throne room. "We'll see about that," roared the king. But before he could leave, the queen gathered an uncustomary strength about her and rose from her throne and spoke out in a voice so clear and so powerful that had stopped the king in his tracks. "Be careful," she commanded. "Don't say anything you can't take back." The king looked at his queen with wide eyes. She had never spoken to him in such a commanding tone. He nodded his promise to her and walked out. The king crossed the courtyard in front of the castle, past the courtiers and merchants, past the guards practicing their maneuvers, and into the door of a turret on the outer wall. He climbed the 179 spiral steps to the top of the turret's tower, the laboratory of his trusty wizard. In angry, impatient words, he described to the wizard what had occurred. "Ah, yes," sighed the wizard. "I had always suspected." This incensed the king even more. "Wizard," he said, "I don't know where my son is, but I want you to cast a spell and send me to him this moment. Once there, I will snatch him back by his hair if I must, and drag him back home." "You object to his romance with Prince Carl, I trust?" asked the wizard. "Of course I do. Now do as I bid you." The wizard had just the thing. A potion that would instantly transport the king to wherever his son was, and allow him to be invisible in case he wanted to spy. The king drank the potion thirstily. The wizard asked the king, "What happens if you get there and you decide that your son has made the correct choice?" The king seethed in anger. "I will bet my life that I am right and he is wrong." The king had spoken hastily, because whenever you make a bet or a wager in the presence of a wizard, especially in the middle of a spell being cast, it must be upheld by the great spirits. The king had actually bet his life. The king noted this as soon as he had said it, but didn't give it another thought. So certain was he in his conviction. Within the blink of an eye, the king was transported to the side of a pond on a faraway farm. He stood a few yards away from his son, the prince, sitting under a tree with this Prince Carl he had heard about. He almost raced to them immediately, ready to reveal himself and take the prince away. Lord only knows what he would have done to Carl, but he was stopped by the sight of them, in a configuration that was at once alien and familiar to him. The pair sat against a tree, with the prince's head leaned over on Carl's shoulder. They held hands. The king was reminded of this image, which was exactly as the queen had leaned her head upon his shoulder when they were young and had the time to sit under trees by ponds. They laughed, they talked, they laughed some more. The king, so ready a few moments ago to strike, or worse, found himself smiling along to some of the charming stories the two told each other. At one moment, they even shared a brief kiss. The king was surprised by how very expected, how usual this seemed. He had never seen two men kiss before, but this affection, this obvious love, seemed perfectly natural at this moment. Then the mood grew darker. "Carl," said the prince, "I must return home tomorrow. I am expected back with a bride. I have failed." Carl ran his fingers through the prince's hair. "You haven't failed, my prince, because you have loved me." "Yes," said the prince, "but I have failed my parents, my kingdom. I wish I could marry you. I love you so dearly, but I cannot." They kissed with tears in their eyes their goodbye. The king didn't realize it, but he was crying too. A lone, shimmering tear rolled down his cheek, and thus the wizard was summoned. "Oh, wizard," sighed the king, "I bet my life against my son's true happiness, and I was wrong. This is what love looks like. I had a vision for his future, for the future of my kingdom. But the true vision of the future belongs to our children, and not to me. I forfeit my life due to my hasty heart and angry words. The wizard smiled. "Your Majesty," he said, "there is but one thing more powerful in this world than my magic. It is stronger than pride, than anger, than hate. It is love, the most powerful force on earth. You spoke earlier from pride. These new words of love please the great spirits more than any frivolous debt." And suddenly, the king was whisked back to his throne room, safe and sound, and next to the worried, hopeful queen. The king sobbed, not from guilt or fear, but from a very different kind of pride than he had known before. He was proud of his son. A week later, after many, many miles, the prince rode through the kingdom gates on his horse. He dismounted and walked through the castle, passing portrait after portrait of dead ancestors, all of whom had married and bore children, one after the other as expected. They led to the throne room and his parents, who had assembled the entire court, all the lords and ladies. He stood before them all, nervous. The king rose. "My son," he said, "a year ago you were sent from this castle to find a fitting marriage partner. Have you done so?" The prince was terrified, but found the courage to say, "Yes, father." The king smiled. "Good then, who is it?" After several moments of deadly silence, the prince told his story, his travels, the dangers, the mysterious lands he visited, and about Carl, the sweet, beautiful prince of a faraway land. The prince finished his story, and the room stood in silence. The king's son continued, "I imagine that there are consequences for my actions, and I am prepared to accept them." "Indeed," replied the king. "Adjoining this great hall is the courtroom, where kings have been crowned and criminals tried and laws decreed. We will find your justice there." He motioned his hand toward the great door that led to the courtroom. When it opened, the prince was amazed. Pews had been assembled, and there were flowers everywhere. Row after row of smiling people were waiting for him. An aisle ran down the middle of the long room, leading to a minister, and standing next to him, Carl, dressed in his dashing best and surrounded by his friends and family, all smiling, all happy. You see, once the king had been whisked by his spell back to his own kingdom, he had sent for Carl and his family to be brought by the fastest horses for a ceremony that would honor the great love between Carl and his son, and which would unite the two kingdoms. What the prince had feared most, the disapproval of his parents, was replaced by what he wanted most, to spend the rest of his life with his best friend. And he did. And they lived happily, gaily even, ever after. So wasn't that a nice fairy tale? My name again is Miss Uma Jules, and I thank you for joining me for a fairy tale by Bo List.